Welcome back, whisky fans. Sticking with the theme of Irish whiskies, today I'm going to be taking a look at the Bushmills 10-year-old Irish single malt. So with this one, whereas the white label is a blended Irish whiskey with single malt whiskey and grain whiskey, this one is a single malt, so there's no grain whiskey in this expression, and we also know that the mash bill would have been 100% malted barley. So this is really an Irish whiskey that's kind of copying, for want of a better word, the Scottish single malt style. In most supermarkets you can see this bottle for around £30, although it does regularly dip in price down into the low 20s. So Bushmills single malt 10-year-old, what do you get for nearly twice the price if it's not on offer as the Bushmills white label? Well, for one, you get a cork, which you don't get on the white label, which is a screw cap. You still get the whiskey butt. And you get an age statement, obviously, being a 10-year-old single malt. Is it non-chill filtered and natural colour? Doesn't say, and I would guess probably still not, because if you compare it to the white label, it's a bit deceptive because there's not much left in the white label, but they're almost exactly the same suspiciously orange colour. So probably artificially coloured. They're very clear whiskies, so they're probably chill filtered as well, but kind of what you expect. It is still a 40% whiskey, which is a little bit disappointing because the price is starting to creep up, but it's still affordable, and I think that it still just about works at 40%. Other details from the label on this one: we know that it's triple distilled, we know that it's made from 100% malted barley, and we know from the back label that it's matured in a combination of casks for 10 years, in casks seasoned with bourbon and Oloroso sherry. Now, I think that's a very odd thing to say, because it's common for a lot of whiskey all over the world to be matured. When it says sherry matured or sherry finished, it's common for those casks to be, more often than not, either American standard bourbon casks or hogsheads, which are seasoned with sherry, so they treat them with sherry and then empty that sherry out before they mature the whiskey, because it gives a sweeter and more approachable profile and a much more economical production than sourcing, transporting and using genuine European oak sherry butts. But I've never seen a whiskey say that it's matured in casks that have been seasoned with bourbon. So that kind of makes you think that they're pouring bourbon into casks to get the casks to soak up that bourbon, but I imagine they probably just mean that they're using ex-bourbon casks. So key details really are that this has got a minimum guaranteed age statement of 10 years compared to the white label. There's no grain whiskey gone into this, no use of continuous stills, and no grains go into this other than malted barley. Let's get some in the glass, see what it's like. Again, quite like the bottles on these. Nice and compact, doesn't take up too much space, doesn't show off too much. Nice, clean, compact form factor. Probably a little bit of a shame that they tend to sell this stuff in boxes. Unnecessary packaging, but they're obviously trying to make it seem that little bit more fancy compared to the white label and compared to similarly priced products. So Bushmills 10-year-old single malt on the nose. So that does immediately seem quite a bit more mature and more refined than the white label. It's just missing all of those not horrible notes, but slightly immature, youthful notes that we had on the white label. It's also more of an appleiness coming through on this one. So it's interesting that this is more of a Scottish style whiskey, being single malt, compared to the more traditional Irish blend of the white label. And I'm getting more kind of Scotch style appley notes coming through from the malt compared to the white label, where there was much more of a sort of stone fruit, peach and apricot note. It's also quite flowery on the nose. There is a little bit of that Irish peach quality, some rather rich caramel malty notes. I think you're also starting to get much more of an influence from those Oloroso casks. In particular, there's a really nice, sweet, fizzy, orangey Oloroso sherry quality. Also say that there's a rather nice delicate vanilla sponge cake note on the nose of this one, and quite a nice buttery biscuitiness, and that's something that you quite often see in Irish whiskey. So it's good to see that even though it's a single malt, so it's kind of taken its cues from Scotch, it still retains that Irish character. Let's see how it tastes. On the palate, it's definitely got more presence and body than the white label, and it's also, you can tell that it's had those extra years. We know that the grain whisky that goes into this is 5 years old. We don't know about the single malts. You'd like to think that they're a similar-ish age, whereas this one, on average from what they're telling us, is probably around double the age, so it should have more character and be a bit more refined, and I think it is. And again, getting lots of caramel malt, some more of that lovely sweet floral sherry. There's a slightly curious soapy note to the palate on this one, and that's not something that I hate. It's not something that a lot of people go for. Reminds me a little bit of the soapiness that you used to get on some older bottlings of Edredauer. Also getting some really nice tropical fruit on the palate of this one, and there's a little note of sort of chalky sweets like Love Hearts Refreshers, not as intense and kind of sour as those sweets, but just a hint of chalky confectionery. Also on the light palate, I would say that there's some notes of shortbread and those rather stereotypical Irish grainy notes. Obviously not Irish grain whiskey, because there isn't any of that in here, but that sort of Irish cereal character that you get on a lot of Irish whiskey. As for the finish on this one, slightly fruity. I'm going to say that it's the short side of medium in terms of length, and I think the defining characteristic of the finish is a rather nice caramel maltiness. As for a grade on this one, I'm going to go one step up from the white label and give this one a B-. Comparing the two, I think that with the white label, it definitely has more grain character, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a style of whiskey and it's an enjoyable style. It is a more economical production, but that doesn't mean that it's not enjoyable. I think that with this 10-year-old single malt, it's a more mature and sherry-driven style, and it also has more body, as well as probably slightly more flavour in general. So which is better? I think that you really get what you pay for in both cases. I think that the 10-year-old single malt is definitely slightly a better whiskey, but the white label honestly isn't that far behind for quite a lot less money. I think the problem with this 10-year-old single malt is really going to go down to the price though, because whereas the white label, all of the competition at that price point is generally worse than what you get from this whiskey, whereas this one, the price is creeping up into the territory to where you can get some really nice stuff for the same price if this isn't on discount. I still think that this one is better than the vast majority of extreme budget Scotch, but this one with the price is really elevating itself to start to leave that category. It is definitely a slight step up in quality over the white label though. Let me know what you think of Bushmills 10-year-old single malt. Thanks for watching, and cheers.